Hello everyone, and welcome to the Shakespearean Shrew. I am your Shakespearean Shrew, Karen Feiner, lover of all things bard, and this is Michelle Coffman, our Brew Shrew and lover of all things brew. This podcast is a decorum be damned entrance into understanding Shakespeare's stages, for there are many of them, and all the players on it. Today, we are at Michelle's beautiful home in her beautiful kitchen because we are making one of her holiday favorites as we talk about all things podcast and making arroz con leche. All right, so what is that exactly?
So it's like rice that's really gooey, that has lots of milk in it and cinnamon, and it's kind of like a Mexican rice pudding.
Nice. And instead of doing raisins, we're subbing them out with some dates to spice up our lives.
The husband didn't like the raisins, so
we were thinking of doing some more traditional 17th century dishes for you all, but
we are not bakers.
And, their tradition is like ash cake, which kind of tastes like ash. So we thought we would do a tradition that is a little more updated and easier, and we're not going to set anything on fire today.
That's the plan.
That's the master plan. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so on Instagram, we asked people to ask us some questions as we go. So as we cook up our arroz con leche, we will also be looking at some of the questions that have been asked on Instagram and hopefully answering you to the best of our abilities.
We'll try. No promises.
So let's get this party started.
All right. So we're doubling the recipe that we found. So we are doing 2 cups of rice. Do
we have to wash the rice first?
Nah, that's what we're kind of doing because it gets all strained in.
Cool. Okay.
All right, 2 cups of rice, and then we're doing 14 cups of water.
All the water.
That's a lot of water. I still feel there's an error, but we'll see.
This is what the recipe says. And
do you want to start with the questions?
I don't know enough to decide otherwise. Okay. So I'll start pulling up our questions. So we have one question from Savannah, and she asked us, what plays are the most underrated? And this is a really great question, and it's got a lot of different possibilities because are we talking which Shakespeare plays are most underrated? Are we talking about which of his contemporaries are most underrated? Or plays at large? And so I'm gonna take on a few of those questions and see how well I can answer them. So in terms of Shakespeare's plays that are most underrated, I would say Love's Labour's Lost is one of his plays that I think is underrated. It's not performed very often. And so that also is one of the reasons that I think it's underrated. People are just not familiar with it. I think that, what other Shakespeare plays would I say are underrated? Let's see, I would say that, Think.
You're the Shakespearean Shrew.
So I guess the histories are, again, underrated for the same reason, in the sense that they're just not done very often because they're very difficult to perform. It takes a lot of people, big casts, big budgets. And so, again, a lot of the public just isn't very familiar with his history. And I love the Henrys. I think they are fabulous. And I also am a big fan of Richard II. It really shows the beautifully sociopathic nature of some of Shakespeare's villains. So in terms of Shakespeare, those are the ones that I would say are underrated. Two Gentlemen of Verona, as anybody who's listened to my podcast, it's not my favorite.
Which one's not your favorite?
Two Gentlemen of Verona. Basically where two men turn on each other to fight over a woman, whether she wants it or not. So that's a fun one.
I wonder why you don't like it.
Weird.
I know, right?
Let's see. In terms of some of his underrated contemporaries, I would say that Middleton is definitely underrated. And I did a one class that was anything but Shakespeare class. And it was a lot of fun because, again, people don't recognize some of the other players at the time. And, well, by players, I mean playwrights of the time. And so that one is a big one for me. I would say The Three Ladies of London is a great play. I think it showcases the transition between the plays where we see, this is something I can do. I can cut while
you keep talking.
Okay, I'll ramble because that's the other thing Savannah asked for is rambling, and I'm doing great.
We're rambling.
So the other thing I would say, what I was saying with Three Ladies of London is it talks about usury. It talks about, the different sins in the city and personifies them, which is something that was starting to phase out, but it does it in a way that is incredibly successful and interesting. And then again, one of my other favorites is 'Tis Pity She's a Whore. And no, not just because of the title, but it's just a production that is really, really fun. And I know that's an odd one to call fun, but fun and complex. And I really enjoy the complexity of 'Tis Pity. But yeah, so those are some underrated contemporaries of Shakespeare. Well, now we can get into your...
Wait. I think we need to do like a little intro though too, because we kind of just started this podcast like, here's the first episode.
That's true. We started this in a week.
And I don't think we ever like kind of gave them the background of how it started, why it started.
Fair enough. Okay. So we started the Shakespearean Shrew in a week. I joined the Oklahoma Shakespeare in the Park.
Start with the I part.
I joined Oklahoma Shakespeare in the Park. I joined their board. And one of the biggest issues that I saw was just that people didn't know it existed. And my partner is a big podcast listener. And so I went to the artistic director and ruler of all things OSP, Tyler Woods, and I said, I want to start a podcast. And he said, awesome, go for it. And then I went to Michelle and I said...
And she called Michelle.
We're going to start a podcast.
And Michelle said, who?
Actually, it was, who's we? And then I said, well, you and I. And so that is kind of the very quick origin story of the Shakespearean Shrew. Because, as a professor, I love teaching the plays. I love introducing my students to plays, but it's amazing how many people have never been to a play. It's amazing how many people are unfamiliar with Shakespeare. And so that is a big part of what I want to do with this podcast is to allow more people to gain some familiarity with his plays and others, right? Because like I just said, there are definitely some underrated contemporaries that exist. So that's kind of where this started. And I am a lover of all things Bard. I'm not kidding. I have 8 complete works of Shakespeare, but they are all from different publishers, so it doesn't really count as having 8 of the same thing. At least that's how I justify it in my world. And we are both bibliophiles. I have a library. Anything over 1,000 books is a library. So
I'm working my way towards that. Goals.
And I put them everywhere I can fit them. So, which is why we're doing the recording at Michelle's house, because there's more room. So, and then I, of course, not only roped Michelle into the podcast, but I roped Michelle into the board at OSP.
Since then, I've been roped into a position on the board as an officer.
Yes. So, yes, we both have. But, it's the thing about theater is that it always comes with a community. And so that is something that we really wanted to, create and be part of, is this community at OSP and the larger OKC Norman community. And so we've been working a lot with different universities, OCU. Look at me, I got those letters in the right order.
Let's see if we can get the other ones.
And then OSU.
UCO. OCU, UCO.
That was right. That was one of them?
Yeah.
Okay. You made it sound like I was wrong. I was like, am I wrong? And then, of course, I'm a professor at OU, so that gives us an in. So what do you, because I have kind of dragged Michelle into the Shakespeare world, which is not her normal. We definitely love musicals, but Shakespeare was not her main interest before I roped her into it. So what have you kind of found as you have entered the world of Shakespeare? Are there any things that you've really learned that you found really interesting, or productions you've really enjoyed that have changed your perspective of Shakespeare?
So I think one thing that I've really enjoyed is just learning more about Shakespeare through this process, and how he was a rule breaker. He was kind of an enigma. There's a lot of different rumors about him and things like that. And I think it would have been really, really cool to see one of his plays, back in that time. The language is still it takes me a couple minutes to get into the play to kind of get into the rhythm of the language, but I've been picking it up a lot faster. And I mean, at my school, I had to read Shakespeare. English language in general is not my thing. Spanish was actually my first language.
I was like, it's not even your first language.
So analogies and things like that always just mess with my head. And so even trying to go beyond that to try to understand what the hell he's saying half the time. So I do on our podcast, we always ask people what's your favorite line? And then they tell us the line, and then they tell us the meaning. And I'm like, oh, that's really cool. So yeah, I'm baby Shakespeare right now.
So what was do you remember the first play you were
Much Ado About Nothing.
Oh,
and I still love that play.
That's an interesting first.
Yeah.
I'm surprised. What year was that? Do you remember?
I think it was AP English my junior year.
Oh, okay. That makes a little bit more sense. Yeah, because that's a hardcore.
Yeah.
That one's got some pretty rough elements in it. So
yeah, but then of course you like I feel like everyone reads Shakespeare or Romeo and Juliet at one point or another.
yes, my first one was A Midsummer Night's Dream, and it was in my freshman year, and my teacher had us all say ass, say it out loud, stop giggling, say it again. Can we do it without giggling? Okay, let's read A Midsummer Night's Dream.
That is really funny because that we saw that play this past summer. It was so good. It was so funny. You got to tell the story though about Andrew.
Oh,
he doesn't listen to this anyway.
So my partner is not Shakespeare savvy. He's a business guy. That's where his brain is and lives. And so we took him to Midsummer because it's Midsummer. Like, it's, in terms of Shakespeare, it's one of the most accessible. And so we get through the production. It was a great production. We're driving back and he goes, but I don't really understand why the characters kept changing costumes. And I said, wait, what? And so, yeah, he didn't realize that they were changing costumes because they were changing characters. Because in Shakespeare's time, and nowadays even, often characters will play, or players will play multiple roles. One, it was written that way so that not everybody's on stage at the same time, so that people can go off stage, change, come back on stage. And just with the change of a hat or the change of a tunic, they would then represent another character. Because just like today, it's expensive to pay a very large cast, and you didn't have enough people all the time. So that was definitely something that playwrights were aware of and worked with. And so he didn't realize that the fairies and the mechanicals were basically the same players playing different
roles. Yeah.
And so, yeah.
I can only imagine what was going through his head like during the play.
So that was definitely special. But in terms of, you made a great point about how enigmatic Shakespeare is, which is a great segue into Master Weber's question that he asked, which is, did Will write these plays? Do I think that somebody else wrote these plays? And that's a really great question. I have professors coming up to me all the time being like, did you read this latest thing about the latest idea of who actually was William Shakespeare? And I'm going to go with William Shakespeare was William Shakespeare for 100. But this is what everybody needs to understand. When we think of authorship currently, we think of one person sitting down and writing a play or a book from start to finish. That is how we currently think about authorship. The reality was, in 16th century England, 17th century England, really until rather recently, it was completely common to work together and then have one person's name on a production. So it was very frequent for playwrights to take ideas from one another, just full on take them, plagiarize them. That's, again, another current term that, no, you shouldn't do it though. But it's more current than the idea, because before there wasn't ownership of an idea. So even Shakespeare in his productions, so many of them are taken from previous productions. Merchant of Venice, oh yeah. Jew of Venice, mm-hmm. So the Jew of Venice and the Merchant of Venice, the original title for Merchant of Venice was the Jew of Venice. The Jew of Venice was already written. And it is almost exactly the same storyline. He just complicated it. And that's what Shakespeare does. And that's why I stand behind the idea that, yeah, no, like Shakespeare is, you know, a person. We have very few details about his life, but we have details about his life. And that he wrote his own productions. The things that to keep in mind is what he was doing was very dangerous. And that's the other thing to keep in mind is there's a reason that Marlowe was killed in a tiny room in a brawl, supposedly a bar brawl over a bill. If you look at Charles Nichols' book, it's very good, called The Reckoning. That's how it was described, a reckoning in a little room.
I think though, like we went and saw a play that OSP did, Oklahoma Shakespeare in the Park Born with Teeth, and that was my first introduction to really like the life of William Shakespeare. Like I get it's still a play and there's artistic liberties taken, but for the most part, it talks about, it's a 2-person play, and it talks about his relationship with Kit Marlowe and when they would write plays together.
Well, and to be fair, that is very fictionalized in the sense that we don't have any evidence. But again, we do know that, the Merchant of Venice was on the heels of the Jew of Malta. We do know that Shakespeare talked about Marlowe's death in As You Like It, right? He references his death in As You Like It in a coded way. And so that's a really great point, is it allows us to see what was happening at the time. More than their relationship, which is of course fictional, the politics were not. Right? And the politics that were going on at that time, the fact that Marlowe was spying and that many of those individuals in the theater were doing so because the theater was a great place to share information, not just from the stage to the groundlings or those in the seats, but also for people to share information between one another as they watched a play, because everybody was congregating. So it's, again, the idea of the relationships that playwrights had with their patrons, whoever was paying their bills, whether it's Lord Strange, who had his name for a reason, but all of these patrons were paying for more than plays. It seems very safe to say. And so for Shakespeare to go out and publicize his life seems like a very stupid thing to do. And so that, again, comes back to the reason why many documents haven't made it from the 16th century to the 21st century. And so to say that, because we don't have a lot of documentation about Shakespeare, obviously it means that he didn't really exist or he didn't really write those plays, that to me sounds flimsy. There are many other playwrights their plays didn't make it at all, or who we have some notes about their plays, but we don't actually have their productions. So to say, we've got more material from Shakespeare than we do from most playwrights at the time. So that's one of the reasons that I, have issues with the argument that Shakespeare
is someone else.
Yeah. And I also think it's problematic to take that away from him because, he was just a tanner, the son of a tanner. Again, putting limitations on people because of their class, that's a problem for me. I think we've already seen enough people in this world who have exceeded the limitations that society has put on them.
Yep.
And again, it's one of those things that I love so much about Shakespeare. Like,
because he wrote to both classes.
But he was never one to fit, right? Even when everybody else was, writing about the beautiful countryside, right? They had a whole time period where, everyone wanted to write about the beautiful countryside and the idyllic world that exists beyond the city. And then we've got As You Like It, where Shakespeare was like, I grew up in this quote unquote idyllic countryside. You're all ridiculous. Here's what you find in the countryside, right? And so he has no qualms pushing back against what other people are doing.
So, and I don't know if we've talked about this before on the podcast, but you've done some research on Shakespeare's outsiders.
Yes.
Do you think Shakespeare was the ultimate outsider?
I mean, I don't want to say ultimate just because at that time period, there were so many outsiders. And it just depends on your perspective, right? Because women could be bridled and walked down the street for speaking out of turn. Like, it was a position where if you were a Moor, you were a novelty, but you were also at very real risk of losing your life if people wanted to blame you for something. God help you if you were Catholic, because Queen Elizabeth certainly wouldn't. So I think calling him the ultimate outsider is difficult, but I would definitely say, as somebody who we see as very flexible in terms of sexuality, very flexible in terms of class. He's like the OG rock star. He left home in so much familial debt and then came back to buy the biggest house in Stratford because he's balling at that point. And so, would I definitely say that he understood what it meant to be an outsider? Yes. Would I say that he wrote The Outsider better than pretty much anybody else? Yes. But at that time, again, unless you were a male wasp, you were in a dangerous position.
I feel like Karen and I would be walking down the street with bridles.
For sure.
So maybe I don't want to go see one of his plays in his time period. I take it back. Yeah.
It's always one of those things. Like it was always one when I was little where I was like, I feel like I was born in the wrong time period. Like I want to go back in time. But then I learned and I was like, oh, shit was worse. And so I realized that I didn't want to go back in time. I would just like to bring Shakespeare forward because I think that's one of the biggest things about Shakespeare is that
we're going to see a lot of steam right now. Sorry.
Woo-hoo! That's awesome. But that's one of the biggest things about Shakespeare is that he exceeded his time. That's why his plays are still worth watching. I just don't think he was the only one to do that. But he was the best.
Okay, so back to the recipe real quick. So we did 2 cups of rice, 14 cups of water, and 2 cinnamon sticks. Again, we doubled the recipe, so just split that in half if you only want
Okay.
1 serving. Okay, so now we go to,
We can always cut some of this.
yeah. All right, strain out the liquid. Done. Discard cinnamon. Done. Return the rice to the saucepan.
And then we've got some, why will you do that first?
Go ahead.
All right, so we return the rice to the saucepan. We've got some sweetened condensed milk and some evaporated milk.
And some whole milk.
And where's our milk go?
I put
and
it
some
back
whole
in
milk.
there.
So if you're dairy free, you're gonna have to be creative.
I'm gonna turn my mic off while I open these though.
What, you guys didn't want to listen to the sound of a can opener? All right, so we have our beautiful consistency.
So she just needs to be thick. So it kind of like on low heat for 20 to 30 minutes until it thickened up enough. So we're adding the dates, stirring them in. It calls for raisins, but man.
We went outside the box.
Yeah.
Raisins are boring. And then finite.
So hold on. Ooh.
Oh.
Yeah, take the bowl. There you go.
Thanks, Mom.
Hey, I'm the one that cleans this kitchen. Yeah,
fair enough. Valid point. That's good.
Okay, and then you add a little bit of cinnamon to the top.
I mean, both for Lebanese people and for Mexicans, that's a little bit of cinnamon. That's how we do. So in terms of our amazing...
And spoons.
Thank you.
Oh, that smells so good.
Oh, it does smell good. So in terms of our amazing desserts, this is our first effort. So let us know if you have a traditional dessert you want us to try. If it's a hard dessert, well, it might come out on fire, but it'll be really funny in the process.
Yeah, we'll put this dessert up on our when we post this.
But again, let us know if you have any questions that you want answered. We will try to find those answers for you. Or if there's just other things that you want to learn about, because like I've said, we love learning, and in 2025, we're hoping to learn a whole lot more.
Yep.
So thank you all so much for listening. Cheers.
Cheers.
Just remember,
All the world's a stage, and you too can be a shrew.
Mwah.
Bye.